Amen. All right, this morning my assignment was to cover Zechariah chapters 9 and 10. And I have a little bit of an inkling of where you've been with Dr. Sigler, but let me go ahead and sort of just jump in as if I knew what you already had. And chapter 9 begins a new section in the book of Zechariah. Charles Feinberg notes the last 6 chapters of prophecy. This prophecy constitute an incomparable treasury of prophetic truth. Chapters 1 through 8, as you already know, were not, though not exclusively, but they were generally about Zechariah's time, and I'm not even going to try to review those. Chapters 9 through 14 form the second part of the book, so we're starting a new section of the book as a whole here. Again, Zechariah was contemporary with Malachi, and those guys, or not Haggai, and those guys were preaching about the temple needs to be rebuilt, right, about 520. So that's the point. This section here is indeterminate. We're not really sure exactly when, probably years later, but we're not exactly sure when this was. And it's not as easily identified in terms of the time or Zechariah's time, but probably much later. Chapters 1 through 8 were probably given when he was a younger man, and now these are given in his later years. These chapters are divided up into 2 oracles or burdens. In chapter 9 verse 1 we read the burden of the word of the Lord, and then the same phraseology in chapter 12 verse 1, the burden of the Lord. Now, commentators have a great time with this particular term. They love to sort of run with it. A burden. Sometimes it's translated an oracle or even message, but it literally does mean a burden. And the idea of a burden is it a burden to have to deliver it? Well, if it's not good news, I guess it would be a burden to have to go deliver difficult news. Is it a burden to the people upon whom it's pronounced? Well, yeah, in part I think that's it. It's a burden in terms of the judgment that's coming. They're burdened with this word. It certainly does, is one author says, a strange word for a book that's largely a collection of encouragements for the Jewish people in the latter days. I mean, there's much more encouraging here than there is burdensome, but in any case, it does convey something of the prophetic importance of this. This is a burdensome message. This is a heavy message. And the prophet wanted his people to understand it carefully. Again, another author says these verses, or these chapters 9 and 10, form one unit and should be considered together, although some would suggest that chapters 9, 10, and 11 should go together because they're all the one burden, but we'll accept the wisdom of those who have charged me with just doing 2 chapters, and we'll blame them if it doesn't work out real well. Actually, it works out great with me. I don't know what he's going to do with chapter 11. It's going to be hard, but that's his problem. David Barron says the first burden or oracle describes the judgment through the Gentile world power over Israel, how that's finally destroyed and Israel is endowed with strength to overcome her enemies. So this is you're going to see that this, I don't know, again, I know that just the timing of when Tim was going to be gone, but I was sort of surprised he gave me the plum of this particular, these 2 chapters, because this is a very, very rich section of Zechariah's prophecy. And I've just got one brief note there in the middle, because reading the commentators and studying for this lesson, I spent a lot of time wading through different scholarly sort of treatments about who wrote what. I mean, the scholars are always trying to break things up and say one guy wrote chapters 1 through 8 and another guy wrote chapters 9 through 14. And just in case, you don't really, it's not even really that important, but just in case you come across somebody that suggests something like that, there is no compelling reason to believe that Zechariah 9 through 14 was written by any author other than the first half of the book. So we have good reasons to think that this is all one prophet. Again, maybe some of the variations are because the theme is different, the time he's writing is different. So, well, let's, for the sake of time here, let's jump into the text and look at things. The outline here is fairly easy, and again, the chapter division here is not it's not bad, but it's not the happiest of them. Sometimes chapter divisions are really bad. And this isn't terribly bad, but actually you can see that chapters 9 and 10 indeed do go together. The first 8 verses are one unit and describes a time that is future to where Zechariah is. Okay, so Zechariah is writing in between 520, that'd be his first set of messages, down to as late as 508. Some have suggested probably not that late, but something in between those years for our purposes. The time that he's talking about in verses 1 through 8 is yet future. It's a period of history that all of us have maybe heard about, but doesn't figure that prominently in prophetic literature because, frankly, we want to get down to the era of Daniel's era of the 69th week and the advent of Christ. And so, but it's one that those of us that have studied this ancient Near Eastern history know a little bit about, and it's the time of the conquest of Alexander the Great. Now, some of you may have seen, years ago, there was a movie with Richard Burton about Alexander the Great. Does anybody remember this movie at all? You remember this movie? That was the worst movie I've ever seen. In terms of historical, some of those historical movies can be really, interesting and helpful. That was terrible. Acting was horrible. Anybody that learns any history from that learned it wrong. But there was a guy named Alexander the Great. Beyond that, anything in the movie was pretty much dismissed. We know, of course, that Alexander the Great, his mentor was Aristotle, of all people, the philosopher. His father, Philip of Macedon, had sort of a truncated version of the same idea of conquest that Alexander took worldwide. And as a very young man, only into his late 20s and early 30s, he started on world conquest, and he just swept across. This is in Daniel's visions, this is the goat that just takes over everything really fast. Alexander started on his conquest, and everything just started falling like dominoes. The first 8 verses refer to that, only a part of that. The burden of the word of the Lord is against the land of Hadrach, with Damascus as its resting place. And this last phrase here is parenthetical. For the eyes of men, especially all the tribes of Israel, are toward the Lord. Now, a couple of things very quickly about that. We're not sure where Hadrach is. I mean, any speculation on where this particular place is just that speculation. Not really that important. It is probably a town that is at least a sister town, or at least somehow related to Damascus. And isn't it interesting that Damascus remains in the news today? When Alexander rolled through this particular region, what is now modern-day Syria and parts of Iraq, he just rolled through. These fell like dominoes. They just went really fast. And the point there of the prophecy here is that he's just going to just sweep through. The parenthetical phrase there, for the eyes of men, especially all of the tribes of Israel, are toward the Lord, is a difficult phrase in the original to sort of get the exact translation. But I don't think the meaning is difficult. What it means is, for the eyes of men, that is, for anybody who wants to see it, especially all the tribes of Israel, that is, especially the people of God who understand things from a perspective of God working, they can see that it's the Lord's doing. That even what is happening with the conquest of Alexander is not like God had his plans for the world and particularly for his people, and all of a sudden this guy named Alexander came by and everybody went, oh, God went, oh, no, what's going on now? No, this is all the Lord's doing. In other words, anybody who has eyes to see it can see that this is the Lord. He's the one that's behind the movement, even of world powers. And again, if we had time, we could go back to Daniel's prophecy and look at all of the rise of the world powers with the different beasts and visions that he had. But we don't. So verse 2 says, and Hamath also, which borders on it. And again, Hamath has been variously designated as a place. He's just rolling through. But then we get to the latter part of verse 2 there, where it says, Tyre and Sidon, though they are very wise, for Tidon built herself a fortress and piled up silver like dust and gold like the mire of the streets. Behold, the Lord will dispossess her and cast her wealth into the sea, and she will be consumed with fire. Now, that's all a prophecy against Tyre. And if you know Tyre's history, particularly with Alexander the Great, a lot of these phrases will become even more telling. The text that's more often quoted in relationship to the conquest of Tyre by Alexander the Great is Ezekiel chapter 26, verses 1 through 21. Now, think about it. Ezekiel was an exilic prophet, so this is even further back in time, and he prophesied the destruction of Tyre. And it might have looked as if, from Ezekiel's standpoint, it would have been Nebuchadnezzar who would have destroyed Tyre, along with his conquering all of that region before the captivity. But he didn't. In fact, the point is that Tyre was notoriously difficult to conquer, and some thought unconquerable, because here's the interesting feature is that Tyre was a city-state in the ancient world, but its main governmental and military headquarters was on an island just off the coast. Again, if we had time, you should do this sometime. Look at a map of the eastern Mediterranean there and just trace it around. You'll see Cyprus there, and you'll see how it kind of forms this curve. And if you look, the eastern coast there of the Mediterranean Sea is fairly straight-edged, except there's this one spot where there's this little bump that comes out. Well, in the ancient world, it wasn't a bump. There was an island there. And Tyre had its, again, military power and governmental headquarters out on the island. So, whenever a conqueror would come by, they just all run out to the island and hold up there. They piled up their silver like dust on the island, their gold like mire in the streets. They just take all their wealth and all of their arms and everything out there, and they just go out to the island and just wait it out. And what could they do? I mean, these other people would, and they were seafarers, so they had plenty of fish in the sea. They had plenty of food. They had plenty of. They could survive out there indefinitely. And it was like a fortress, so anybody tried to sail out there, they could be bombarded pretty easily. Well, when Alexander the Great got there, and again, if you read this prophecy in Ezekiel 26, you're going to see this even more clearly prophesied. When Alexander the Great got there, he was faced with what every other conqueror had been faced with, everybody out there on the island. How are we going to get to them? So what he did was he started destroying the land part of the city of Tyre, literally tearing it down brick by brick and board by board and dumping it into the sea until he built a causeway all the way out to the island. And then he went out there and besieged the island fortress of Tyre and defeated it. And but the Lord will dispossess her and cast her wealth into the sea, and she will be consumed with fire. That literally became true. That's how Alexander the Great managed to conquer it. Well, I mean, then it was just this one island and a little causeway that was man-made going out, but over the centuries, that causeway is filled in, and that's why you got this little bump right there on the coast. Because now there's no island there at all anymore. It's just kind of an extension of the land. Ezekiel actually predicts that the fishermen are going to spread their nets on the bedrock to dry them out, and that's exactly what happened. Alexander took everything in the city, the houses, the boards, everything, the dirt itself, and scraped them all clean, so there's a part there that is absolutely down to bedrock, and parts of it remain that way to today. But again, with those who have eyes to see, it wasn't Alexander doing this, it was the Lord who was doing this to defeat Tyre. Then in verses 5 down through 8, or 5 through 7 rather, we have a list of what are Philistine cities. Starting at verse 5, Ashkelon will see it and be afraid. Gaza too will writhe in great pain. Also Ekron, for her expectation has been confounded. Moreover, the king will perish from Gaza. Ashkelon will not be inhabited. You know, it'd be terribly impolitic today to go and read that verse anywhere in Israel today. oops. And a mongrel race will dwell in Ashdod. That mongrel race is actually a stronger term in the original. So I'll just let you imagine what that might be. And I will cut off the pride of the Philistines. By the way, they mean the Greeks there. Ironic, isn't it? Every other culture thought the other culture that did speak their language were barbarians. You know, blah, 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 blah. They can't talk. So, we still have that prejudice today, unfortunately, don't we? I mean, if we meet somebody that doesn't speak English really well, we just kind of think they're not very smart. Only, except for the fact that they can speak their original language really well, and English in part, and we can't speak it at all. So, what does an American do when he meets somebody that can't speak English? You speak louder and slower at them. That's how we handle that. But so the Philistines thought the Greeks were barbarians. The Greeks thought that the Germanic tribes were barbarians. I mean, barbarianism is all in the ear of the beholder. But I will cut off the pride of the Philistines, and I will remove their blood from their mouth and detestable things from between their teeth. This is a reference to the fact that he's going to bring to an end their idol worship. The blood and the detestable things, the blood in the mouth. This is a portion of their very grotesque types of worship that they were engaging in, and that's all going to be brought to an end. Then they will also be a remnant for our God, and be like a clan in Judah, and Ekron like a Jebusite. This is a hopeful promise in the end, is that those Philistines are going to be converted. They're going to be brought in. This is a small portion of the promise: in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed, or at least it's on the way to that. Verse 8, which is the last verse in this first section, is a verse that's actually about Jerusalem. But I will camp around my house, reference to my house surely is Jerusalem, because of an army, because of him who passes by and returns, and no oppressor will pass over them anymore. For now I have seen with my eyes. Now, again, we don't have time to get into the details here, but it's clear that the prophet sees, even with all the destruction that Alexander the Great is bringing, that Jerusalem's going to be spared. No oppressor will pass over them anymore. That somehow, with all the destruction that all of these the cities of the coast, they're all feeling, that they're not going to be attacked by Alexander. Now, Josephus, in his history, has a fairly extended explanation of this, about a prayer that was made by the high priest at the time and the delegation that went out to meet Alexander's representatives, and how the faith of the superior faith and religion, if you will, of the Jews dissuaded Alexander from destroying Jerusalem. How much of that has any basis in history, we don't really know, because we don't see that recorded anywhere. But it is true that Alexander, for one reason or another, decided not to besiege or attack Jerusalem. Could very well have been just strategic. I mean, why bother? He's on his way to conquering a lot of stuff. Judea, Jerusalem is up in the hills. He's down on the coastal plain. That's really all he needs in order for his armies to march up and down and be conquest of anything. And by the way, if they take over everything around them, eventually you just absorb them anyway. So could be just a sort of a military reality. Again, the prophet sees this as the protection of the Lord. That's the end of the first section that deals with the era of the conquest of Alexander the Great. Now, we're going to come back. Here's where the historical sort of chronology of these two chapters gets a little out of phase, because just at this point, the author, the prophet, looks way beyond to another deliverance that's even greater than this one. And they typically did that. You had historical deliverance or historical time that the nation was preserved. The prophet saw this as indicative of a greater time of preservation, or a greater time of deliverance. And that's what we have in verses 9 and 10. You're going to recognize this, of course. Rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion. Shout in triumph, O daughter of Jerusalem. Behold, your king is coming to you. He is just, endowed with salvation, humble, and mounted on a donkey, even on a colt, the foal of a donkey. I will cut off the chariot from Ephraim, and the horse from Jerusalem, and the bow of war will be cut off, and he will speak peace to the nations, and his dominion will be from sea to sea, and from the river, that's usually a designation of the Euphrates River, to the ends of the earth. These two verses, I think you recognize the first there from verse 9, as that is the text that's cited both in Matthew 21:5 and in John 12:15 at the time of the triumphal entry, as the fulfillment of, and the story about the colt, the colt and the donkey and everything. Now, since we're not studying Matthew right now, or John even for that matter, I'm not going to delve into this too much. But I should say that what I think is happening is the time when Jesus is sending his disciples to retrieve the donkey and everything is, I think that's all prearranged. I don't think Jesus is just sort of like saying to his disciples, I see a donkey, go get, or anything like that. It looks to me like Jesus has prearranged this. He's doing this. Why? Because he is specifically fulfilling prophecy. Now, we don't like it when, sometimes we don't like it. Sometimes we don't like it when he's fulfilling prophecy by sort of making it happen. We just kind of want it to be, we didn't, he didn't decide to be born in Bethlehem, that's cool. Or the Romans cast lots for his garment, or the 30 pieces of silver that just we happened to. We sort of like that. We like the sort of fulfillment of prophecy. There's kind of whoa, that's cool. To say that Jesus actually set it up to fulfill this prophecy seems like a little less than fulfillment. It's sort of like you couldn't fulfill prophecy by finding a donkey and getting on it and riding it into wheeling. No one's going to think you're fulfilling prophecy that way. But I really think that that's what's going on there. But the key is that just like if you think about it in Luke 4, this is my favorite example. If you go to Luke 4, he goes into the synagogue and reads from the Isaiah scroll, and he reads partway through Isaiah 61, verses 1 and 2, and stops and then says, today this has been fulfilled in your hearing. It's the same thing. He's purposely fulfilling prophecy, but up to a point, to make a point. And the big point here is this. You see this over and over again in the prophecies of Messianic prophecies in the Old Testament. Something that's a given for us is that there's a first coming and a second coming. It's a given. We don't, that's a part of how we think about Messianic prophecy before you even start reading it. The greenest believer who hadn't studied anything about prophecy at all starts reading the prophecies in the Old Testament and knows first coming, second coming. But you see, this is the thing that the Old Testament prophets didn't see. They saw one coming, the coming of the Messiah, and it's the burden, if you will, of the New Testament authors, particularly Luke is my classic example of this, but the other gospel writers as well, to say, no, there's a second coming. There's a first coming and there's a second coming. And Jesus is setting things up from Luke 4 to Matthew 21 verse 5 there. He's setting this up to say, yes, this is me, I'm here, but that's not all. There's something yet to come. So he goes to this text, back to Zechariah, and what we have here is clearly a fulfillment of the Lord coming. This is the two comings, in my notes here, it's the two comings phenomena characteristic. These two verses at the heart of chapter 9 form a pivot between verses 1 through 8 and 11 through 17 and enlarge on the Messianic teaching that we've already seen. So what we've got here is the arrival of the King. By the way, we're coming up on Advent, Christmas time, okay? You'll sing Christmas carols. How many of you are looking forward to, Christmas carols? Again. Anyway, one you should not sing is Joy to the World. Okay? Joy to the World. That's not about the first coming. That's about the second coming. Okay? But we sing in that. Anybody starts singing that at the first coming, you're not getting it. Okay? If you're thinking second coming, even though you're celebrating first coming, I guess that's okay. But this is Joy to the World. Behold, your King is coming to you. And he was. Okay? And he's got four things here. I have to do this fast. He's just. He's endowed with salvation. Ding, 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 ding. Salvation. First coming. What's that all about? Salvation. And just. That's what? Righteousness. Right? So this is all about salvation. Humble and mounted on a donkey. Now, the absolute condescension of Jesus coming, although he existed in the form of God, did not regard equality with God a thing to be, grasped. He emptied himself, became a servant, came down here. The coming for us for salvation, that's the point. And mounted on a donkey. Now, this is a metaphor that I think is mostly lost simply because it's connected to that word humble right here. Okay? And here's the problem. Is because it's very typical. You might think that if he's riding in on a horse, he's the conquering king, and he would be. He'd be Alexander, riding in on a horse to conquer. But he comes in on a donkey because he's humble. No, it's because he's so powerful he doesn't need a horse. Okay? He's going to come and conquer. He's riding a donkey, and he's still going to conquer. I mean, this is the point. The point is that it's not a part of the condescension. It's clearly, you could study this, Walter Kaiser in his book on Messianic Prophecy, or a former professor of mine, Don Fowler, who's down at Liberty University, he basically used to have conniptions when anybody thought that this was about humility. No, this is as clear a symbol of a claim to sovereignty as you could possibly make in the ancient Near Eastern world. You come riding in on a donkey, you expect everybody to just bow by the force of who you are. You don't even need a horse or a sword. And that's the issue there. The point is that he comes in and he conquers that way. Now, what we have is a gap between verses 9 and 10. This is the gap that, again, the Old Testament prophet here, Zechariah, doesn't know anything about. Just like Isaiah didn't know anything about the gap between the first and second coming that we read in Isaiah 61. But the gap is he's going to come and will cut off the chariot and the horse from Jerusalem, and the bow of war will be cut off. And he's going to speak peace to the nations, dominion from sea to sea, from the river to the end of the earth. And I don't have time to detail all of that, but that's second coming, folks, when he comes to set up the kingdom. So here's the irony. The king comes bringing salvation, but he hasn't brought the kingdom yet. That's going to happen later. And that's second coming. First coming, second coming. One salvation, one kingdom. It goes. It's so constant in the unfolding of the prophetic work of the Messiah that it shouldn't be that difficult for us. But it does. A lot of people. Because what happens is a lot of people say, well, he came as a king, and he came to bring salvation, and they're all okay with that. And then they say, but that kingdom part, that's spiritual. He's a spiritual king. He's just going to be a spiritual king, a spiritually conquering thing. He's going to bring peace. So he brings peace to my heart. He's going to speak peace to the nation and bring peace to my heart. No, that's not it. That's a geopolitical reality that he's really going to come. And the point is that Jesus came in literally riding on a donkey in order to go to the cross, because the next time he appears, he's going to be literally bringing in the next part. You can't accept that the triumphal entry happened in time and space and history, literally, and then suggest that what's happening in verse 10 is some kind of a spiritual thing. It doesn't work. Well, this then inaugurates the next part here that really goes, I think, from the rest of chapter 9 into chapter 12, although I've divided the nation's victories. We don't need to get too much into these for the sake of time. Again, we don't have a lot of historical clarity here. When we come back to verse 11, as for you, because of the blood of my covenant with you, I have set your prisoners free from the waterless pit. Return to the stronghold. In other words, the blood of the covenant, I think, people say, well, which covenant is he talking about there? I think that's the Abrahamic covenant, which is the main covenant. So God has made a promise to Abraham, and that's the main covenant. So on the basis of that covenant, he's going to set the prisoners free. Return to the stronghold, O prisoners. For this very day I'm declaring to you, I will restore double to you. For I will bend Judah as my bow, and fill the bow with Ephraim, and I will stir up your sons, O Zion, against your sons, O Greece, and I will make you like a warrior's sword. I think, again, I don't think any author, knows exactly what's time period and everything, but that sounds to me like a lot like the Maccabees. At the time when, Alexander's kingdom divided into 4 parts. One part was the Seleucids. They took over what's in Damascus now. They were still Greeks. That's the problem that the Jews had, was that their overlords, the Seleucids, were trying to make them Greek instead of Jewish. And this is why they sent Antiochus down there. You know this part where he defiles the temple. They're resisting all of that. It's the Maccabees that are resisting. I think that's what this is prophesying. He's going to raise up these kinds of warriors. Then in verse 14, however, again, I think we sort of leap back to the future, if you will, talking about the arrival of the shepherd king. If the victories achieved by the Maccabees are something that is a historical record, we can think of the coming of the shepherd king, and the shepherd king's coming is revealed in chapter 9, verse 14, all the way through chapter 12. Various people have outlined this differently, and knowing the brevity of our time here together and my proclivity to speak way too much about the stuff at the beginning and not leave time at the end, this is why the outline there is very short. But don't get the idea that it's not important, okay? I just knew I'd be running out of time. This little intimidating red thing is disappearing. So, but here's what we have. You look at the outline there in your notes. As the one author says, in verses 14 through 17, Zechariah begins to show how the one who was early introduced as the king will function as a shepherd to the people. So the shepherd, or the king that's coming, will be a shepherd king. Verses 14 and 15, and I won't take time to read these in detail, demonstrate the victories that he's going to bring. And then in verses 16 and 17, he talks about the salvation that he's going to bring. Again, the prophets don't separate these ideas. The prophets can move back and forth between, geopolitical victories of the nation brought by the shepherd king and the salvation brought by the shepherd king. And again, for them, it's all of one thing. For us, we recognize, that's first coming, that's second coming. By the way, this is where a lot of people look at the way we would understand Scripture like this, with this and expecting a literal fulfillment coming, and they would say, that's just too neat. That's just too neat. You got these things. This verse goes here, and this verse goes here, and these things like that. And that's a strange argument to me. So in other words, you would admit the fact that if we have this sort of framework, first coming, second coming, literal coming to bring salvation, literal coming to bring the kingdom, these verses apply here, these verses apply there, that's too neat. So what do you want with biblical interpretation? Messy? Somehow fuzzy is better than really clear? Again, it boggles my mind. Yeah, I think it's pretty clear. What he does is you can go back and forth here. Chapter 10 opens up with a promise of the provision for his people. Again, I think that's back to the time of clear back to the Maccabees again. He's going to provide. He's going to send the earlier and latter rains are a very well known and well worn metaphor in terms of God's provision for his people. He's going to bring them. The danger is that there are these false teachers and faithless shepherds in verses 2 and 3. And I can just make a quick comment about that. Again, it's one of the kinds of things that as a Christian, theologian, Bible teacher, pastor, that people just don't like these days is for somebody to stand up and say, I think something's wrong. I think that's wrong. I think that's wrong. I think that's wrong over here. I think it's like we're all just can't we all just get along? And the answer is no. Sorry, it's not going to happen. Why? Because Moses warned us about false teachers. The prophets warned us about false teachers. Jesus warned us about false teachers. The apostles warned us about false teachers. And the most telling argument of all, there actually are such things as false teachers out there, okay? The devil's not going to walk in and put his cloven hoof up on the pulpit and, show us his pitchfork and say, here I am, I'm the angel of light. No. We see through that, right? The point is there are such things as false teachers. We better be ready to expose them. And the Lord says his anger is kindled against the shepherds. Now he's talking about false shepherds there. And I will punish the male goats. He has visited his flock. He will make them like a majestic horse. He's going to bring the victory over them. He's going to be the one to provide. I'll be happy in the day when we're all going to learn from the Lord, and no man will say know Him, because we're all going to know Him. We're all going to be learning from Him directly. All right? I'll be out of the job. It should be fine with me, as long as we're learning from Him. Now, in the last, I'll come back to to verse 4, where we have the 4 names of the Messiah. Then there's a battle. The king's battle for and compassion for his people. And the great climax of this, which is not the climax because I'm going to back up here in a second, the great climax is the regathering of his people. This is one of the great regathering texts in the Old Testament. You know, there's dozens of them. Just yesterday, I got to speak to the group at the campus at Moody called Kesher. This is the Jewish Studies group. They wanted me to come and speak on why I believe that there's a future for national Israel. And I landed hard on the series of texts that talk about regathering. It's not just like something that shows up somewhere vaguely in Romans chapter 11. I think it's there, and I don't think it's vague. But it's over and over and over again. The Lord is promising a regathering, a regathering, a regathering. I've got 3 lines, single-spaced, of text references of texts that talk about the regathering of the nation. And this is one of them. He's going to gather them. Look, He's going to whistle for them. They're going to be coming. They're going to be numerous. I mean, this is the great hope. I mean, the point is that anybody that doesn't think that there's going to be a great regathering of the nation of Israel in the end times has to jump through some spiritualizing hoops. Frankly, one of the professors at Westminster Seminary said he didn't believe in dispensational eschatology and a future for national Israel. But if he did, he'd keep coming back to Zechariah in order to keep proving the point. I mean, he knows this is a strong text to say that Israel is going to be regathered. But before I finish, my time is completely out there. Go back to verse 4 and look at the description here of our coming king. There are 4 terms here. From them will come the cornerstone, the tent peg, the bow of battle, and from them every ruler, all of them together. That's a difficult phrase in the original. The cornerstone, I don't need to describe that too much, right? You know what the cornerstone is. The cornerstone is the stone that makes everything else what it is. It's the stone from which all of the other architectural features of the building have to be oriented. Okay, so a lot of times we think of this as the foundation stone. I'm not going to argue with it necessarily, but the cornerstone is more than just the thing that the thing rests on. It's the stone from which all of the other measurements, this stone in the right place, is going to make sure everything else fits correctly. That's what our great cornerstone is. And this is now from a well-known metaphor to one from them the tent peg. Boy, that blesses your heart, doesn't it? Okay, Jesus is my tent peg. What does that mean? Okay, well, I think in context, in parallelism, it could be just that stake. Anybody do camping? Yeah. Anybody do camping? It's that one. You got to put that stake out there to hold it. It could be that. But actually, I think it's the picture of the way that they would put up tents in that day, of having one central pole that, again, everything was suspended on. Everything goes to that. I think that's what it's, he's the center pole of my tent. And he's going to be, that provides the stability for everything. And then there's the bow of battle. And again, I think that's a pretty clear metaphor there. He's the bow of battle. Everybody's looking forward to Armageddon. It's going to be a real letdown. Frankly, I don't know, the apocalyptic movies and everything. You're going to have all these armies moving, and Jesus is going to show up and say, "We're done here." Boom. But it's pretty much over with that way. It's not going to be this big conflagration, everything like that. Jesus said, "I think we're done here." Boom. Time to, slay all his enemies and bring in the kingdom. He's the bow, okay? And I think then that informs what he's talking about. And from them, every ruler, again, as I say, the idea there is, the word ruler there is actually a word that's often used in a negative sense of somebody that's an oppressor or a despot. But the point is that, I honestly do think that the best form of government is not democracy. Can I get an amen? The best form of government is a theocracy, I want a benevolent dictator who's good, okay? That's going to be great. I mean, I want somebody that's really going to do this. I want somebody that really rules that way. I think that's what this term, it's kind of a negative term, but applied to Christ, it's a very good thing. Jesus is going to say, this is the way it's going to be. By the way, it says we're going to rule and reign with Jesus. You know, the church, we're going to rule. I don't think, you know, we're not going to be out there, enforcing things and writing tickets and stuff like that. No, I think Jesus is going to say, I think we need to do this, and we're all going to be going, yay, Jesus, yeah. do that. That's the extent of our reigning with him, okay? It's going to be like, the court of King Louis XIV. Anything he wants, yes. I think that's the way you need to do it. The shepherd king, when he comes to rule, is going to bring to fruition a final era of prosperity and peace, and his conquest, to take this back to the beginning of chapter 9, is going to make Alexander's conquest look like a walk in the park. He's going to rule everything.